Welcome to the High Rise Podcast, presented by Headset, the leading data and analytics company for the cannabis industry.
So, Emily, you know the mantra, the future of cannabis is beverage. You hear that all the time, everywhere. There's plenty of articles, there's plenty of opinions. Well, I think they're right, actually. But I think it looks more like the future of cannabis is going to be beverage alcohol.
Yeah, it seems like Tilray's decided that the cannabis industry is a bunch of hosers. So sounds like they're pivoting into the sud space.
They are indeed. And yeah, this is a pretty big headline, and most have seen it, but I thought we could probably dig into it, or we could dig into it and try and unpack it. And what does this really mean? And what are they becoming? So the headline that you're referring to is the fact that Tilray is purchasing 8 beverage brands from ABI, which is Anheuser-Busch InBev, for $85 million in cash. And those brands are brands that I recognize, many of them, not all of them, but I'm sure our listeners have seen them on the shelves. Brands including Shock Top, Breckenridge Brewery, Blue Point Brewing Company, 10 Barrel Brewing Company, Red Hook, which is a Seattle, I think one of the original Seattle craft beer. I think Red Hook actually started Seattle craft beer. But they're long gone. They got acquired and then acquired by ABI. Widmer Brothers, Square Mile Cider Company, and Highball Energy. So I've seen a lot of these out there on the store shelves. So they're grabbing 8 of these brands from Anheuser-Busch. I think from what I read, the interviews that they had kind of talked to Anheuser-Busch about maybe bringing on, taking some of these off their hands. I'm not sure if this was like solicited, if they were trying to, ABI was looking to just shop these guys. But in the end, this $85 million transaction, subject to working capital and other adjustments, is what they put in the SEC filing. And they are saying, Tilray is saying that this is expected to make them the 5th largest U.S. craft beer business with $250 million in pro forma revenue annualized. And the last thing from the announcement is their CEO said it's driven by continued delays in U.S. federal cannabis legalization and more recently delays in adult use legalization in Germany. So they called out the U.S. and Germany. You're right. So
Okay.
I guess the Europe strategy is a big piece of this, but hey, we can't get into Germany. Let's go buy some beer companies.
If
Totally
you
makes
can't build
sense.
it, buy revenue, I guess.
That's right. Maybe they need to start investing in German beer companies like Hofbrau or what have you. So that
I
way they're
sip
ready.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. So a pretty big headline, and it's not the first time, right? Tilray has purchased a beer company. They did Sweetwater, a number of others. So this just kind of goes into their portfolio. I was surprised, with this many. I guess when you're at the grocery store, the craft beer section is so massive now, and there are so many logos there. And here in Seattle, I'm sure San Francisco, very similar. Like you have a lot of the local
Yep.
kind of Seattle, San Francisco breweries, but then you have these craft breweries that are not local but of the similar scale, and then you have the crafty. Have you heard that term? Crafty breweries. It's like these ABI breweries where they're craft, but they're owned by Anheuser-Busch and produced by
Right.
Anheuser-Busch. So I think kind of the beer aficionados would call them crafty because they're owned by the big conglomerates, and you get some people that are real sensitive to that, right? They don't want to buy corporate beer, but it is right. So when I saw the 5th largest, I was like, that's with this many breweries under their umbrella, some big notable names and stuff they already had. I thought they'd be like way up there on the list, but obviously there's a lot more out there. But still, to go to 5th that quickly kind of turns them into a bit more of a beer company, if not a beer company with maybe a cannabis thing on the side, or are they a cannabis thing with a beer company on the side? It's kind of, or does it matter, right?
I mean, it's highly regulated consumer products is the theme here, I guess. Hops and cannabis is pretty similar in terms of terpenes and smells and tastes and everything. I mean, I like the taste of beer. I also like the smell and taste of cannabis. So these things can work for me. I'm a big fan of the beer category and specifically the craft and local beer category. I always talk about how a few years ago, many years ago now, I was at the Roth conference down in kind of actually your old stomping grounds in Southern California, and I got to sit in on a craft beer panel, and I actually remember it very vividly because I thought there were a lot of really good lessons to be learned from what the craft beer industry has gone through. And one of the things that they talked about, and it was an interesting representation. I'm trying to remember which companies were there, but Lagunitas was on the panel, which is it's a Petaluma based, which is just north of me. They have a really fun tap room with live music, but um, Lagunitas CEO, or one of the, I can't remember, it was someone from high up in the leadership team, was talking about one of the challenges that he faced that he thought was an important lesson for the cannabis industry is that people gain affinity for types of beer, not necessarily brands of beer. And this was something they were trying to really shift. Like, people developed a taste profile for West Coast style IPAs, which is actually different from other IPAs. And it tended to be boozier and all these things. But Lagunitas was like, we're having trouble differentiating ourselves from Ballast Point or from any of these other brewers that have come up and had pretty cult followings. And then people just become loyal to that type of beer and they try everything within the category and not really loyal to a brand per se. So that was an interesting takeaway for me in terms of how we think about strains or product categories in cannabis, and thinking about how you develop an affinity for a brand, not a type of product.
Yeah, so
But
you're in the cannabis analogy, it'd be like I only like sativas, or I only like indicas, or even I only like um, diesels
right,
or
eliminating
kushes or
forward
whatever.
strains. Yeah.
Right, right. Which I think makes total sense. Although I would argue, I don't know anybody who has a type of spiced Belgian wheat beer as like their go-to, which is what Shock Top is. It's like I only drink spiced Belgian wheat,
I think,
and I yeah, I don't think it's doing that well either. Because I pulled some numbers for Shock Top, and in
yeah,
2020 they were brewing 320,000 barrels, and I don't remember those are barrels like keg
yeah.
size, right. So there's a lot of beer bottles that come out of that, and then in 2021, down 25%, so they only started brewing 240,000, and then in 2022, 200,000 barrels. So definitely declining. I know that
Well,
there's COVID in there, right? The on-premise restaurant purchasing and stuff, but it is declined. It went from 320,000 to 200,000. Um,
yeah, I'll tell you what's going on with Shock Top. This is very straightforward. Shock Top is an entry level beer for mostly probably female target demographic. It has a taste profile that a little bit covers up the like more hoppy and like bitter taste of beer. This is true. And so, what has probably occurred with Shock Top is that the seltzer category is eating its lunch, and also the Gen Zers are not drinking as much, especially
so true.
beer. And so this is a category where I would be looking very carefully. This is why I'm so refined about my point of view on brands and what you buy and what you pay for and what you want to build. And for me, I'm looking for things that are growing and categories that are expanding, not looking to catch a falling knife. So I'm just going to be honest about what's going on with Shock Top. It's nice of you to give them a COVID pass, but that is, if
I
you ask
know.
me, that is not what's going on there. Now,
I know. Just try. Yeah. Sorry.
you're
Go. Keep
trying to be
going.
nice. Okay. I will say that Blue Point is a good beer brand, and they do have really nice products, like the Toasted Lager is one of my favorites. But in Widmer, that's another one that's a more approachable brand product. But I think it's so there are similarities and things like to your point. No, I actually didn't even know that's officially what Shock Top is a spiced.
Spiced wheat,
Yeah.
Belgian style, something like that. Yeah.
But I'm just thinking about, the consumer categories and thinking about how you can do this. But if you're going to have a a company that is focused on, as we said at the outset, a consumer product that has to operate in a heavily regulated market, bev alc is your next closest analog. And we know, I think we already covered it on the podcast about a year or so ago about the purchase of the distillery too in Colorado.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so
So they definitely made the moves prior to this. So just makes them bigger. But you mentioned Lagunitas, and that's a good segue because I did want to talk about alcohol investing in cannabis which was the theme. And now, we've flipped it around where you've got, you know, cannabis investing in alcohol. So Lagunitas is actually owned by Heineken. So it's their
Yes.
craft brewing arm. And yeah, we have a Lagunitas tap room in Seattle too. Even though I know they're like a Petaluma based um, company, they have one here for some reason. But in California, I don't think in Washington State, but they have launched a THC infused sparkling water, and that kind of goes to your hops and uh, what cannabis like overlap, right? The
Yeah.
cannabis
The
plant,
terpene. Yeah.
yeah, the
Yeah.
terpene profile. So they saw that, right? And I remember way back when they had vape pens that were like beer hop flavored, and now they're doing, sparkling water. So pretty interesting overlap there. But before that, you had Constellation, who did the big canopy growth deal, which was $4 billion,
Yep.
which God knows where, that went, but it went somewhere. And big dreams on that, right? And obviously lots changed since then, but that was a massive investment. This is a $85 million investment, much smaller.
Much
um
smaller.
yeah, at the same time you had Molson Coors and Hexo, or Hydropothecary Corporation. Remember that, before they were just Hexo as an LP. So you had them coming in, and I think they did a drink in Canada, or do a drink, some 10 milligram sparkling thing.
Yep.
Um, and then obviously you have ABI and Tilray with all this stuff.
Hmm.
I think that they were doing stuff originally. There was a relationship there with ABI, like tagged Tilray as
Hmm.
their entry into the race, right? It's like everyone had to have their own. And then
Yeah.
like the big spirits like Pernod Ricard, Diageo, they were all like, we'll wait and see. And so they saved their 4 billion. But maybe they'll come back around. So pretty, interesting to see the kind of tables have turned a little bit, on this stuff. But the beer business, I mean, that's a great point, that Shock Top is the gateway beer for, other drinks. It's a drinkable thing. And now there's a lot more, right? And you're right, seltzers exist. I think that the selection has just gotten so much broader that craft beer unto itself, like, I don't think is performing that well overall in just the general market. And to what you're saying about, the people that have experience, and they say, okay, well, they're buying a type, they're buying an IPA or whatever. Um, that, I'm sure that's part of it. I think that there was an explosion of breweries, and I think it's really hard to get scale when it's so noisy. I think it's hard to get shelf space at grocery, right? Just to those fridges are full already, right? Where are they going to fit you in? They got to drop SKUs. I think all of these things are compounding pretty much against craft beer, and have some metrics on like what that means. So before I get
Yeah.
into that, I mean, anything you want to touch on as far as those investments and I don't know, the flipping it around and kind of reinvesting back in?
Yeah, no, I mean, like honestly, I do think that there is a lot of crossover and consideration between Bev Elk and cannabis. It's natural. I mean, even just the history of Bev Elk, of having gone through its own prohibition and then having become a legal market, and we're still, unfortunately dwelling in a prohibition period as cannabis. But of course, I remember, I mean, Absolute Extracts and Lagunitas doing those relationships. I thought that was really neat because it was very on brand, and they were actually right next door to each other in Santa Rosa and Petaluma, and they shared actually some of the same kind of like facility areas for distribution. And then like PBR getting into the space, it also felt like an interesting
Oh,
thing.
right.
Sam Adams, as we talked about, as Sam Adams is really noted as one of the first American craft beers, besides our beloved Anchor Steam, which is now closed in San Francisco. We actually
And
had
Sam
another.
Adams,
Hmm.
Boston Brewing Company, which
Yeah.
owns I read that they produce more Mike's Hard Lemonade, I think, is their like top selling SKU than beer, right? To the point of like entry drinks, right? I think that's actually where more of their business comes from than beer at this point.
I mean, everyone kind of starts around Mike's Hard Lemonade. That's like a hangover. Well, anyway, but but even here in San Francisco, we lost another excellent brewery called Harmonic just last week announced they're
Oh no.
closing their doors too. Yeah, I think it's been a tough category because of, I think it's a couple of things. I think the distribution, which we also, I mean, drawing analogs all over the place. We face distribution channels issues as an industry. Craft beer had a highly fragmented and challenging distribution strategy. And to your point about shelf space, getting on shelves, like I remember when I was consulting for PepsiCo, like just trying to manage even just soft drinks and juices. Talk about then, of course, the proliferation of all of these beers and trying to understand what everything is. And when you have a consumer who's like, I like IPAs, I start there and then like try all these things, it just becomes more and more difficult. And there's a ton of lessons to be learned here. But I have believed that there would be an intersection here, especially like, as you know, being based in Northern California, I see the wine industry has also started to come around toward cannabis. And with Spark, we're in Sonoma, and Sonoma, we actually learned how to do biodynamic farming from a long running biodynamic wine grower. And there are a lot of overlaps. It's an agricultural product that's been turned into a premium form factor that you can ostensibly sell for a good margin and create experience around. That's the story of Bev Elk, specifically wine and beer, and then cannabis. So it all makes a lot of sense to me. And I don't necessarily think these things have to live in silos or separated worlds. So I could see the convergence. And then if the future of cannabis is beverage, and just like a quick sidebar anecdote, I was talking to a dear family friend of mine who, when we first got into cannabis, had not touched cannabis in over 20 years. And now he was telling me that he and his wife and all of his friends in Massachusetts are often drinking cannabis multiple times a week, where they're kind of taking a break from alcohol. And again, it's this trend towards this healthier beverage solution, but kind of giving you a similar effect, similar form factor. Now, just one thing I want to say on that, on the distribution piece, is alcohol distribution has existed for a long time, and it is complex because unit weight by volume, heavier in a liquid form, and then all of the
Sure.
form factor considerations on cans, bottles, all these things. So there is some hypothesis that being able to partner up or be bought by these companies or have them under the same umbrella, then you're able to leverage a lot of the same resources for distribution of heavy products that are also temperature sensitive, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of things to think about as the category evolves. But yeah, so just some thoughts there.
Yeah, and I think the shipping is a real concern when you look at alcohol and you look at price by weight. I think for shipping, like beer, it will sell for what, $12 a six pack, $15 a six pack. It's getting kind of expensive for craft beer, but it used to be $10, right? And for that weight, that's $10, and there's a margin, so they're selling it in at some margin, right? So that compared to wine, which a wine bottle might be, $40. I mean, I know there's like the Charles Shaw, $2 chuck at Trader Joe's, which I don't think is $2 anymore, but there's the cheap stuff. But I think on average, a wine bottle is going to be 30, $40. And then you think about spirits, right? And same thing, very expensive for spirits for the weight, right? So shipping all that weight, but your margins are better. You're making more dollars for every bottle you sell, versus to make that much back, you have to sell a lot more beer, right? Which means shipping a lot more beer. So it's even compounded for them in the alcohol space. Like it's already hard, like shipping liquid around, right? But it's even tougher for beer, which just has a lower price point, so you're making smaller margin dollar wise in the end. But I want to talk about this National Beer Wholesalers Association's BPI metric, the Beer Purchasers Index. So from their website, they said, this is an informal monthly statistical release giving distributors a timely and reliable indicator of industry beer purchasing activity. It's the only forward-looking indicator for the industry to measure expected beer demand 1 month forward. Similar to the widely recognized Purchasing Managers Index, which I think is like an S&P product, the BPI is a net rising index. Net rising index means that it takes in expansion and it subtracts like contraction. And a leading indicator of the industry performance based on survey responses from participating beer purchases. So it's survey driven. So, hopefully they're surveying the right people. Hopefully everyone's participating in the survey. Doesn't really talk about, the sample, um, but it's something. It's some metric. It's also an industry association, that's supporting the industry. There may be some bias there, but the reading system says that if it's greater than 50, it indicates that the segment is expanding. A reading below 50 indicates the segment is contracting, and obviously 50, you're just not moving, right? So craft beer, and they have all different types of beer, like the cheap stuff, craft stuff, specialty, what have you. They haven't broken out, but I looked up craft beer, and the index as of July, craft index is at 39, which continues to signal contraction. But the good news, they said, is it's 7 points above July of 2022. And the takeaway on that was that more people are buying beer at restaurants, because I think it's like a total sale. So, the things have opened up more and more from July 2022. I think that's helping, but still 39. That means that this is a contracting segment. And I read that it's the mid tier, they're saying, that's getting squeezed. These kind
Yep.
of, they're not giant, and they're not the tiny little like hole in the wall ones that are like self-sustaining and service a neighborhood. But
Hmm.
it's this mid tier that just is it's like the adolescent size. You know what I mean? Not quite adults, not really kids, but they can't break out of it. And a lot of that has to do with the investments that they've had to make in expansion and production, and the debt that they've had to take on and all that, right? So I don't know if these are, maybe they're mid-tier now that they're part of Tilray. I think that part of this deal is that there's like a transition where they ABI is going to run the facility or something, but I feel like they're going to be mid-tier and going to be impacted by this. I just don't see a shock top. I don't know how they're going to expand that category, like how they're going to grow that brand at this point, right? I just feel like it's just going to decline. Those brewbound numbers of the barrels that they produced, I mean, that's a significant deficit there. So they're doing it for a reason. U.S. is taking too long to legalize. They're hoping that would have happened. This mention of Germany and the bets on Germany, I think they started those 4 years ago, 5 years ago, right? So
Hmm.
it's crazy. So early on, and they're still banking on it, and yeah, it's not there. So they're doing this. But what I wanted to ask, and I would just kind of discuss as we close out, is like, is this a Canadian trend that's going to be destined for the US? Like, these Canadian LPs, well funded, they're in a federally legal operating environment, and they're expanding into US alcohol.
Hmm.
And is this the same thing that we're going to see in a US federally legal market where we're, I don't know, a large MSO is expanding into alcohol? When I read things like coming out of GTI, for example, and it's like cannabis is a great alternative to alcohol, right?
Yeah.
From Ben Kovler over there, right?
Yeah.
So I, not that it precludes it, but it seems to be very like this kind of, you're on this side or that side, right? And
Yeah.
with some of these operators, so part of me thinks that it's they're looking for more exposure. They've got these valuations, they've got to find growth, and like Tilray in Canada and the headset data is not keeping pace with the growth of the market. So Canadian year over year growth was about 11.5%, 11.35%. And Tilray's brands like Riff and Soleil and their others have completely lagged behind that curve, right? So they're not finding growth in those markets.
Right.
And so, I feel like this is a chance for them to go and say, you know what, maybe we'll get growth in the Bev Alc, but then they're buying brands, and not to loop them all together. I'm not that familiar with all these brands, but just looking at the shock top data, it seems like a you know, kind of a contracting brand, right? I don't
Yeah.
know how they expand that brand. And the other ones, yeah, again, I'm no expert, on the numbers on these brands or like the consumer of these brands. Um, but ABI offloaded them for a reason, right? And so, is this the right strategy here? And is it something that we would see, these others do? Should we expect more of it? As is the question.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you're struggling well, so Canada is I think one thing, I don't think this is the exact path we'll see occurring in the US. In fact, if anything, I do think we see the wine and spirits companies investing in the cannabis companies and either
Yeah.
placing strategic investments or buying them ultimately outright, or investing into joint projects to launch non-alcoholic cannabis beverage or consumer products themselves.
And the difference is going to be that when the alcohol industry made these big investments like Constellation into Canada, there was nothing. It was just dreams,
It
right?
was all
Of, yeah, there's going to be this adult use market and it's going to be amazing. And then restrictions started coming out, like, oh, here's what the package looks like. Oh, you can only produce this much as far as potency. And then the realities, right? The stores and the distribution. And in the US, it's going to be different because their market exists, right? And there is adult use already. In Canada, there was no adult use. They were just had this vision of what it could be, turned out to be very different. But in the US, I think it'll make it a lot easier to make those kinds of bets that you're saying, because they'll see actual, oh, this is actually working. Drinks are getting
yeah.
made, or products are getting sold to 21 and older.
Yeah. So, I mean, yes. And, yeah, you're right. It was all cocktails and dreams back then for Constellation, to reference a really difficult to watch 80s movie, but cocktail. But, I think that now we have real data. Now we understand how these markets work. We're actually understanding who the core consumers are, what the drivers are, what the limitations on the product categories are. And I mean, one could say that this is, the Canadian attempt to establish a distribution footprint for when the US does change its laws and for when interstate commerce happens. I'm a skeptic on that timeline. For God's sakes, we still can't even get perfunctory banking reform. But I think that's like kind of the thesis here, not to mention buying revenue. My guess is just like whatever any beer conglomerate would do, is that they'll shut. Maybe that was like a package deal, and to get Blue Point, they had to take Shock Top. And sometimes you have to take package deals when you're making these purchasing decisions, and then you can shutter something if it's a loss leader, if you're making very careful P&L driven decisions around these products. I mean, that's really what happened with Anchor Steam and Sapporo. Sapporo had bought them, and then there were some things that occurred, and the margin profile changed and did not go in a positive direction. And Sapporo just made a P&L decision and just and cut it. So this is how these things go. And I guess that's the kind of the future of the crafty market, per what you were saying, versus like I read the same data too that shows these smaller regional, maybe like just kind of compactly vertical. They're not really trying to overextend on distribution unless they're hooking into a distributor who's getting them on shelves. But those seem to be thriving, and that makes sense. It does resonate with what is left of Gen Z and the millennials who do drink alcohol. They tend to have affinities for that kind of a brand and are pretty savvy about who owns what, or at least they profess to be. So I think it does matter. But I do think it'll be because Canada, there's a couple other things to note. Canada was federally legal. And so that does change the dynamic. We are not federally legal, so that changes the dynamic. But nobody knows how to work in a fragmented industry patchwork setup more than the alcohol industry. I mean, even when I talk to the winemakers north, because we spend time in Sonoma and Napa, I mean, they have a whole litany of different regulations that they have to tackle in terms of when they're shipping wine across the country. And there's a lot of logistical pieces to that are not just about the packaging and the weight. It's also just about what is acceptable state by state. So there's different regulations in New Jersey versus like Massachusetts, and you have to be aware of that. And I know that's actually been a big effort in Diageo and Constellation to try to create some overarching framework that helps them on that. But it sounds like it's still, after all these years, a very difficult logistical endeavor, which is why conglomerates exist if you're going to try to go big, because the only way to do that is through economies of scale at a corporate level, which we all know is very difficult in cannabis. But so that's my prediction, is it's going to actually be a little bit the inverse of it in the US. Now, the one thing, the wild card that everybody's watching, is what's going on with Delta 8 and Delta 9 dry from hemp, and the kind of looser regulations around that, and what the operating companies will do. Because it seems as though I'm hearing that operators are going to start thinking about that as another channel to expand their brand footprint that won't be limited to licensed retail outlets and vertical programs. So that's one wild card that could very well play in on beverage and other aspects of consumer categories around cannabis.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know. I don't know if I'd see like the alcohol companies investing in that kind of space because I think the federal, I don't know,
They're
it's
going
this
to watch
federal
it.
gray area. Feels tenuous, but it's also so hard to track. Like certain states will ban it, certain states allow it. And it's a whole thing. And then you have places like Minnesota where you can buy THC infused drinks at liquor stores and restaurants, which is super cool, but super unique, right? So there more and more overlap, I guess. We'll certainly see. And I'm with you. With better legalization, I think we'll see a lot more of this. And yeah, maybe with the Delta 8 hemp derived Delta 9, maybe there's something to happen there too. People are always sniffing around. But we did talk a lot about Canada, and I do want to mention we haven't forgotten about the good old US of A here. We are going to cover the news coming out of Ohio, which was legalized. Just kidding.
No, that was like at Hall of Flowers last year when they were like, "Weed is
Yes, right.
legal." We were like, "No, there's a nuance missing there." No, no. So the good news out of Ohio was there was a question around whether or not they had sufficient signatures to get it on the ballot in November for adult use. They officially not only got the signatures but blew well past the required signatures on the after the review. So it, in fact, will be on the ballot in November. I think that a ballot drive that shows such strong support year over year is a good indicator of how it could go at the polls. So fingers crossed there. Right now, there are 5 vertically integrated operators already in the market: Verano, Curaleaf, GTI. Wait, that's more Acreage, Ascend, and Columbia Care. So, well, Ascend is not yet open in the market, I think, but or maybe they are. They are. But I think, you know, that's just to start. I know there's a lot of other independent operators there, but I'm excited about this. It's a big market, lots of colleges. Again, a broad and adjacent reach into New York State, where there's a, you know, the flailing program there, and Pennsylvania, where there's still not adult use. Um, so, you know, there's a lot of good things to come out of Ohio. So, um, I'm excited to see what happens next. So I think next week we're going to be talking about the potential market size and some of the data aspects of this, as well as a rundown on some of the other state to state dynamics.
Yeah, perfect. And in the meantime, we should probably grab a shock top and help prop up those numbers a little bit.
Thanks for listening to the High Rise Podcast, presented by Headset. For more information on Headset, visit headset.io.